Most people see cargo ships as nothing more than floating stacks of steel containers crossing the ocean. What they don't see is what life is actually like once those ships disappear beyond the horizon. For weeks at a time, the crew is completely isolated, no nearby ports. It's a job built on routine, the same decks, the same inspections, the same faces, every single day, which is exactly why the smallest thing out of place is impossible to ignore. The 3 stories you're about to hear all come from sailors working aboard commercial cargo ships during ordinary voyages. No immediate help, just a handful of sailors surrounded by thousands of containers and hundreds of miles of open water in every direction. None of them expected anything unusual until one routine inspection, one strange discovery, or one impossible encounter changed the rest of their careers forever. These are 3 disturbing cargo ship horror stories. I spent nearly 9 years working aboard commercial container ships. Most people picture cargo ships as floating stacks of metal boxes slowly crossing the ocean. They're not wrong, but what most people don't realize is how isolated those ships really are. Once you're several hundred miles from land, there's no pulling over, no police, no immediate rescue. If something goes wrong, the crew is on its own until the next port. After a while, every voyage starts feeling the same. Load cargo, leave port, stand your watch, maintain the equipment, repeat. That's probably why I remember container 2479 so clearly. It happened during a transatlantic voyage from Halifax to Rotterdam in the autumn of 2022. I was serving as second cargo officer, which meant one of my responsibilities was inspecting the deck cargo every evening after sunset. Most inspections were routine. I'd walk the rows of containers looking for damaged locks, loose lashings, signs of shifting cargo, or anything that could become dangerous during rough seas. That evening, we'd been underway for less than 12 hours. The weather was calm, visibility was excellent. I was checking container numbers against the loading manifest when one container immediately caught my attention. Instead of the usual barcode sticker mounted beside the locking rods, someone had written a message across the steel door with thick red paint. "Do not open at sea." I actually stopped walking. In nearly a decade at sea, I'd never seen anything like it. Every shipping container is identified by standardized markings. Nobody writes warnings directly onto them. I checked the manifest. Container 2479. Destination Rotterdam. Cargo, industrial hydraulic equipment. Hazard classification none. Nothing unusual. I called the chief officer over the radio. When he arrived, I pointed at the writing. He stared at it for a few seconds before shrugging. Probably something left over from the shipper. He photographed the container for the voyage report and told me to continue the inspection. That should have been the end of it. 3 nights later, the banging started. It was just after midnight. I was asleep when someone knocked on my cabin door. It was one of the able seamen. He looked uneasy. "Can you come up on deck? Something's making noise forward." At first I assumed one of the container lashings had worked loose. Metal expands and contracts at sea. It wasn't uncommon to hear occasional knocks during temperature changes. But the moment I stepped onto the forward deck, I knew this was different. The sound was rhythmic. 3 heavy bangs. Then silence. Another 3. Then silence again. It was coming from somewhere inside the container stacks. The chief engineer arrived a few minutes later. We spent nearly 20 minutes checking every visible lashing bar. Everything was secure. The banging stopped completely while we were standing there. The moment we started walking away, it began again. 3 heavy impacts, always from the same direction. The captain joined us shortly afterward. His first assumption was that a piece of machinery inside one of the containers had broken loose during the voyage. It happens occasionally. If heavy equipment isn't secured properly before loading, it can shift with the movement of the ship. We marked the container's location and decided to inspect it again at first light. Morning came. The sea was almost perfectly calm. Container 2479 looked exactly as it had the night before. No dents, no damaged seals, nothing out of place. The captain contacted the shipping company by satellite phone. They confirmed the cargo manifest. Industrial hydraulic equipment, nothing living, nothing hazardous, nothing requiring special handling. That night, the banging returned, exactly the same, always after midnight, always stopping the instant anyone got close enough to identify which container it was coming from. By the fourth night, even the captain admitted something wasn't right. The chief engineer suggested checking the electronic temperature monitor attached to the container. Although it wasn't refrigerated, many modern containers include sensors that record internal conditions throughout the voyage. He downloaded the data. Everyone gathered around his laptop. The graph made no sense. At 11:40 p.m., the internal temperature was 6 degrees Celsius. 40 minutes later, it had climbed to 31. An hour later, it had dropped back below 10. Then it repeated. No machinery inside that container should have been capable of generating that kind of heat, especially not in the middle of the Atlantic. The captain contacted the shipping company again. They insisted the cargo had been inspected before departure. The seals matched. The paperwork matched. There was absolutely no reason to open the container before reaching Rotterdam. So we didn't. For the rest of the crossing, none of us mentioned the warning painted on the door. But every night, someone volunteered to take the forward inspection with a partner instead of alone. We reached Rotterdam 6 days later. Before a single container was unloaded, customs officers boarded the ship. The captain requested that container 2479 be inspected first. The seal number matched the manifest exactly, no evidence of tampering. The customs supervisor cut the seal. The doors swung open. Everything inside matched the shipping documents. Large wooden crates containing industrial hydraulic equipment, exactly what the manifest listed. For a few moments, everyone thought we'd imagined the entire thing. Then one of the inspectors noticed fresh screw marks beneath the rearmost pallet. The machinery was unloaded. The wooden platform beneath it was lifted away. Underneath, hidden between the steel floor and the cargo, was a narrow compartment, barely wide enough for one person to lie down. It was empty. A sleeping bag had been folded against one wall. Several empty water bottles rolled across the floor. There were fresh food wrappers, a flashlight, a portable battery pack, and a ventilation pipe that had been carefully routed through the cargo itself. One customs officer reached inside, then immediately looked back at the rest of us. The floor's still warm. The investigation lasted almost a year. Authorities discovered container 2479 had crossed 3 different oceans over the previous 8 months. It had passed through dozens of ports. Every inspection had cleared it. No one ever identified who had been hiding inside, or how they managed to leave the container before every customs search. I left the Merchant Navy 2 years later. People sometimes ask me what the strangest thing I ever saw at sea was. It wasn't the warning painted across the container. It wasn't the banging we heard every night. It was realizing that someone had spent months traveling around the world, inside a steel box, while hundreds of trained sailors walked past it every single day, without ever knowing they weren't alone. I've spent almost 11 years working aboard container ships. Most people think life at sea is exciting. It isn't. 99% of the job is routine. Standing watch, checking cargo lashings, inspecting safety equipment, walking the same steel decks every night until you know every bolt and every staircase by memory. That's exactly why you notice when something doesn't belong. This happened during a voyage from Busan to Long Beach. I was serving as the ship's second officer, and one of my responsibilities was conducting the midnight security inspection. Every night between midnight and 2 in the morning, I'd walk the entire vessel, engine room, accommodation block, forward deck, container stacks. The inspection wasn't just for safety. International shipping companies take stowaways seriously. If someone boards before departure and isn't discovered until another country, it becomes a massive legal problem. So every night, I checked everything. 3 weeks into the voyage, the weather had finally settled after 2 days of rough seas. It was around 12:40 a.m. when I reached the forward container stacks. The only sounds were the engines below me and the wind moving between the rows of containers. Then I saw it, a flashlight, not pointed at me, not waving around, just a narrow white beam moving slowly between two rows of containers nearly 100 feet ahead. I stopped walking. At first I assumed it was one of the able seamen finishing maintenance. I picked up my radio. "Bridge, this is second officer. Who's working forward?" There was a brief pause. Then the officer on watch answered, "Nobody." I looked back toward the light. It was still moving. Slowly, almost casually. I asked him to double check. A few seconds later he came back. "Everyone's accounted for. No maintenance tonight." I started walking toward it. The beam disappeared behind another row of containers. I turned the corner. Nothing. No one. I checked every aisle nearby. Empty. The flashlight was gone. I convinced myself I'd reflected moonlight off a piece of steel. It happens. The next night, I saw it again. Same location. Same steady movement. Again I radioed the bridge. Again every crew member was accounted for. This time I walked faster. Every time I rounded another stack, the light vanished behind the next one. It never moved erratically. It never looked like someone running. It was almost as if whoever held it knew exactly how fast I could walk. Eventually I reached the last row of containers. There was nowhere else to go. The beam disappeared. The deck was empty. Then I noticed something on the top of the nearest container. Fresh boot prints, dark rubber soles, still wet from the evening condensation. The footprints didn't stop there. They continued from one container roof to another. Whoever had been carrying that flashlight hadn't been walking on the deck. They'd been moving across the tops of the containers. I immediately called the captain. Within minutes, nearly the entire crew was searching the forward deck. We checked every access ladder, every maintenance platform, every empty container. Nothing. The following afternoon, the captain reviewed security footage from every exterior camera. Nothing unusual. No flashlight. No unknown person. The cameras covering the forward deck simply didn't have the right angle to see between the stacks. The captain ordered additional patrols. For the next 2 nights, nothing happened. Then on the 4th night, the flashlight came back. Exactly 12:43 a.m. Exactly the same location. This time the captain watched from the bridge while I remained on deck. The ship's thermal cameras were capable of detecting body heat even in complete darkness. The captain radioed me immediately. "I've got one heat signature." I stopped walking. "Where?" "Moving toward your position." I looked around. Nothing. The flashlight wasn't pointing toward me anymore. Instead, it crossed another row of containers. The captain kept giving directions. "It's not wandering. It's walking with purpose." I stayed exactly where I was. The captain narrated everything he was seeing. It stopped. Container row 16. I heard nothing. Then, "It's moving again." Now row 18. It stopped. Again. The captain sounded confused. "It's only stopping at specific containers. Not looking around. It already knows where they're located." Then the heat signature disappeared completely behind the final stack. By the time I reached that area, there was no one there. When we arrived in Long Beach, customs officers were already waiting. The captain requested inspections on the 3 containers where the heat signature had stopped. Every security seal was intact. The first container held televisions, exactly as listed. The second contained office furniture. Again, everything matched the manifest. The third carried boxed clothing destined for a retail warehouse. Nothing appeared unusual until one customs inspector tapped the ceiling with a flashlight. It sounded hollow. They removed several interior panels. Hidden above the cargo was a narrow crawl space, just large enough for one person. Inside were 2 sleeping bags, empty food packets, fresh batteries, a portable flashlight, a handwritten notebook. Every page contained rough sketches of cargo ships. Different names, different routes, different ports. Some pages included handwritten notes about crew routines, security patrol times, camera blind spots, which exterior ladders were rarely used. On the final page, there was only one sentence: "Never stay until the destination." Authorities from several countries became involved. Investigators concluded someone had likely been moving from ship to ship for years, crossing international waters without passports, visas, or immigration records. No fingerprints matched any database. No DNA identified a suspect. No one ever discovered where they boarded or how they disappeared before each inspection. I finished 2 more contracts after that voyage, but I never walked the forward deck the same way again. Because every time my flashlight reached the next row of containers, I couldn't stop wondering whether someone was already standing on the roof above me, waiting for me to walk past before moving again. I spent 7 years working aboard commercial cargo ships. If you've never been on one, it's difficult to explain just how repetitive life becomes after a few weeks at sea. Every day follows almost the same schedule, the same meal times, the same maintenance routines, the same people. After a while, you know every crew member by the sound of their footsteps. That's why this bothered me so much. It happened during a 6-week voyage across the Pacific. I'd recently been promoted to second officer, and one of my new responsibilities was conducting the daily crew muster. Every morning before work began, I checked every crew member against the official manifest. 23 names, 23 faces. It was one of the simplest parts of the job. For the first 2 weeks, everything was normal. Then our chief steward knocked on my cabin one afternoon. He looked annoyed. "Someone keeps taking an extra dinner." I assumed he'd miscounted. He showed me the galley log. 24 meal trays had been prepared. I counted the crew list again. 23. 1 extra tray wasn't unusual. Someone might have gone back for seconds. We laughed about it and moved on. The next day, it happened again. 24 breakfast trays, 24 lunches, 24 dinners, every day. Always one more than the number of people on board. The steward accused the engine crew of taking extra food. The engineers blamed the deck crew. Everyone denied it. The captain eventually dismissed it as sloppy bookkeeping. Then I started noticing something else. Someone had been using the shower in the emergency accommodation block. That section of the ship had been locked since we left port. The floor was wet. There was steam on the mirror. But nobody admitted going inside. The captain ordered me to inspect every unused compartment. I found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No missing equipment. Nothing that explained where the extra food was going. 3 nights later, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I decided to review the CCTV footage covering the galley entrance. The system only recorded movement, so I skipped through the timestamps. At exactly 2:11 a.m., the camera activated. Someone walked into the galley. The person wore standard blue coveralls, steel-toe boots, a white hard hat, exactly like everyone else on board. They moved with complete confidence, opened the refrigerator, prepared a meal, poured coffee, then left. The strange part wasn't what they were doing. It was what they never did. They never looked toward the camera. Most crew members glanced at it without thinking. This person never acknowledged it once. I paused the recording, zoomed in. The reflective name patch on the coveralls became readable. I felt my stomach tighten. The name belonged to a dock worker who had died during cargo loading 6 months before our ship was even commissioned. I replayed the footage 3 more times. Same uniform, same name. The next morning I showed it to the captain. He immediately ordered a complete search of the vessel. Every cabin, every machinery space, every storage locker, every empty container. Nothing. When we arrived in Vancouver, port security boarded the ship before anyone was allowed ashore. Investigators collected fingerprints from every occupied cabin. They matched all 23 crew members. No unidentified prints were found. They also examined the CCTV system. The footage was authentic. It hadn't been edited. No signs of tampering. The investigators eventually found one thing that none of us had noticed. Inside an unused emergency cabin near the stern was a neatly folded blanket, several empty food wrappers, a portable flashlight, and a notebook. Every page contained observations about the crew, who started work first, who stayed awake the latest, which stairwells were used least often. The final page contained only one sentence: "No one questions a familiar uniform." The investigation lasted almost a year. Authorities concluded that someone had somehow gained unauthorized access to multiple commercial ships using stolen maritime credentials. No arrests were ever made. No suspect was identified. I still work in shipping today. But every time I conduct a crew muster, I count everyone twice, because I've learned something that sounds impossible until you've lived it. On a cargo ship in the middle of the ocean, you stop recognizing faces long before you stop recognizing routines. And sometimes, that's exactly what someone is counting on.